Hi, I'm Renee Williams,
And I'm Billy Thomas.
and welcome to another edition of From the Woods Today. First of all, we really appreciate you joining us. But last year, we had a segment on about extreme temperatures
Mhm.
and bugs. We did that. Dr. Jonathan Larson did a show for us. This year, I keep hearing, well, it's been a whole lot colder. We've had
And it has
negative.
been. It
It
has been a
has.
little
We've
colder.
had negative temperatures. We've had, that kind of thing. And so this year they're dying out. So we are going to do a rooting out the myths and we're going to learn more.
Yeah, I love it. Really excited about today's show. I was saying earlier, two of my favorite doctors are with us today. We got Dr. Larson, our resident entomologist, as well as Dr. Crocker, our forest health specialist, and really excited about having both these folks on. They're really great contributors to the show on a regular basis. But as you said, talking about some pretty interesting topics as well. A lot of us have to deal with ticks and other things out there when we're
Mhm.
out in the woods. And yeah, the hope is that maybe those few weeks of freezing weather might have been enough to knock back those
Knock them
populations.
out.
Come on, just help us out a little bit, right?
Just a little bit, we're just
Yeah, but
asking for a little.
we just need a little, just a little help. But
Mhm.
so hopefully Dr. Larson can shed some light on that subject. And we always enjoy having him on. He's such a great presenter, so knowledgeable, and really just an amazing resource. And then we'll have Dr. Ellen Crocker talking about something you also might have to deal with out in your
Mhm.
property on the sides of the road. You might see these little flowers popping up all over on these little shrubs and trees, and they can cause a lot of problems for your area. So we're going to have Dr. Crocker talking about another pesky plant.
Mhm.
This is one we're all familiar with. Many of y'all may have it in your yard, and it can cause some problems there as well, as they have a tendency to
Definitely.
fall apart with ice storms and other things. But we'll
Mhm.
have Dr. Crocker talking about that as well. But, again, folks, this show's all about you all and what you all need to be good stewards of our forests and wildlife and natural resources. So if you all ever want to see a topic, Renee does a great job of tracking it down. So I'm really looking forward to this one, Renee, this great show. So if you all have questions for any of our presenters or Renee or myself, please use the chat function if you're on Zoom with us. And if you're on YouTube or a podcast listener, thank you very much. We really appreciate that. And we can interact with you via email at forestry.extension@uky.edu. But Renee, glad to be with you today on this really exciting show.
Yeah, definitely. So let's go ahead and get started. Dr. Larson, if you want to turn your camera on, welcome to the show. We greatly appreciate it. And I've heard so much that, oh, it's been so much colder this year. So
Mhm.
these bugs are dead this year. Are they?
No, they'll be fine.
Oh.
You just went straight to the
I just
punchline.
I'm gonna dash people's hopes. They've been around for a long time. They've seen cold, they've seen all these problems before, so they're gonna be just fine. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is. When we talk about insects, I think it's important to point out that this is something we always hope for, that they'll get frozen out, that maybe
Mhm.
they'll get burned out if it's a hotter time of the summer, but they have life cycles that are adapted to handle these extreme temperatures. They have traits that they use to get them away from those cold temperatures, in particular, since we're coming out of it from the cold to now. There's still a big pile of snow here on campus that's still melting, so we're not fully free of this yet. But
Yeah.
just talk a little bit about how they do that and why it's so important. And I've got my little cartoon mantis here, who's having a
Oh,
Yeah, love
having a
it.
good time in the
yes,
winter.
no doubt.
Love it.
Appreciate you.
Appreciate it.
I'm happy to be here. So, when we talk about insects and climate, it's important to point out that their lives are very much controlled by climatic factors. And the piece of the climate that most impacts their ability to survive in a certain area or to thrive in a certain area is temperature. There are other climatic variables, right? Things like precipitation and others that can be important, but I don't think anything rules the roost quite like temperature does in an insect's life. And that's because, to use a fancy word, insects are poikiliothermic, meaning that essentially their body is the same temperature as the environment around them. Insects, we don't necessarily call it cold blooded in this case, but it's analogous. Whatever temperature they're surrounded by. So if they're sitting on a dewy log in the morning out in the woods, and that log and the air around it is a nice 72 degrees, the insect itself is somewhere around 72 degrees. If, on the other hand, they're sitting on a rock out in the middle of the sun in the middle of a yard, that rock might be getting up to 101, 102 degrees Fahrenheit. If they sit on that for very long, they also will end up at that temperature. That's why we see them moving and kind of skittering into different places. The temperature that they experience wherever they live is one of the most important factors in determining the range of where insects can live. So my examples here are a firefly, a number of species of firefly, and then a spotted lanternfly, this invasive pest we've been talking a lot about. In the United States, we talk a lot about northern and southern species, and that's because of temperature. Some insects are able to survive better in the more southern states because it is warmer for longer periods of time, and there may be more diversity there. And diversity meaning a greater number of species of any given insect. That's what you're seeing with the fireflies. So in the warmer states of Texas and Florida and Georgia and Alabama, we see a pretty great diversity there. It's important to point out that there's a lot of diversity in some northern states as well, such as New York State, which we see is kind of similar or analogous in biodiversity to those two more southern states. So it's not the only thing that impacts them, but it is something that allows for them to diversify and it allows for them to survive in some of these places better. This is also important with invasives like the spotted lanternfly because the climate that they find in their new home in the area that they're invading, it has to match up with the climate that they're used to in their native range. And we can create maps that show us, okay, the climate variables of this location in the United States matches up very closely with the climate in the location that they're from in their native range. And we can build areas where we think they will have a very suitable match. And this heat map that you're seeing on the right is showing where people project the spotted lanternfly to do the best. You'll see that there's kind of a spotted lanternfly belt that we expect to develop across Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri. Kentucky is somewhat hospitable to this particular insect. So we're going to have them, and we've got a lot of them right now up in the northern horn of Kentucky. But in some of our more warmer counties, the further west we go, we may actually see less suitability for this insect. And then in some of our deeper mountainous, more mountainous counties, we may see even less suitability for it. And this is most likely to do with the temperature. It's just not the temperature that they want to be around. So they're not going to survive as well there. What this sort of involves is going into the insect's life cycle. So an insect, in order to develop, when it's exposed to temperatures, it is going to be able to develop a certain number of degree days based on the temperature that it's being exposed to. So in this given geographic area, if an egg is laid, the egg is going to hatch after a certain number of degree days. And it will either hatch into a larva, like we see with the beetle on the left, or it could hatch into a nymph, like we see with the grasshopper on the right. The numbers that you see here are translating what we would use for the growing degree days into actual days. A growing degree day, it's a really weird sort of nebulous concept, I think, to try and explain fully, but it's the accumulation of development on days above a certain temperature threshold. So when we are doing the math to assess how many growing degree days have happened in any given day, we take the high temperature and the low temperature, and we do some calculations to figure out how many growing degree days happened on a calendar day. You can have calendar days with no growing degree days, but you can't have a calendar day with negative growing degree days. We never go backwards. We just stay arrested. That's highlighting that this certain temperature threshold has to be reached for them to start sort of ticking like a clock. And then they can accumulate one or two or even 12 or 15 growing degree days in any given day, depending on what the high and low temperatures were that day. It's kind of like stacking Legos. Like imagine you could only stack one Lego on top of another Lego if the average temperature for a given day was 72 degrees. If it doesn't hit that average, you can't put the Lego on top. If it does, then you can. That's kind of how a growing degree day works. We use this to our advantage to be able to track insects and sort of warn people when they may be developing. And depending on the species, if we have enough growing degree days in a growing season, this could lead to there being multiple generations of certain insects each summer if they're warm enough. So some insects, they only go one generation per year. That's all they can squeeze in an area. But if it's an insect in a warmer environment, they may develop faster through those more immature stages and get to adulthood quicker. And therefore, they're able to make eggs and generate another generation. And we see this with invasives, we see this with native species. Here in Kentucky, a lot of pests that we deal with tend to have one generation. There is a subset that has multiple generations that tend to be bigger pests. But most of them, our growing season is only long enough to give them one generation per sort of shoot. So they're not going bonkers out there developing 3 or 4 generations. How does this all come together with what we're talking about with winter? So we can have insects that, as they're going through this growing degree day development, they can buffer some of the negative effects that we see from high temperatures and from low temperatures by developing or hiding in places like in the soil or down in leaf litter. When we see this, they are using these areas to try and dampen the effects of the air temperature. These are much more stable environments that they're living in. There's usually a temperature that they are used to for the whole growing season almost, and that means that they're not going to be impacted by these highs and lows. Others are what we call stop and go growers. They may develop faster during the summer. They enter a more arrested state in the winter, and they're not going backwards again. I want to reiterate that. They're not going to revert from a caterpillar to an egg or anything, but they are arrested and they can't develop because there's not enough growing degree days being accumulated. But then once the warmth returns, they'll start to develop again, and then they'll reach the next stage of life. If we see these seasons coming through and changing, we also can see things like precipitation come into an area with snow that can offer some actual help for insects and their relatives, where we can create that subnuvian zone where there's kind of a pocket of warmer temperature than what is up in the air, and they can hide out there. There's lots and lots of ways that insects can do this. All of these things that I'm talking about amount to what we term an overwintering strategy, which is the method through which any given species will persist to the next year. Insects are the most successful animals that have ever dwelt on this planet. Some people might argue and say that we're the most successful because, we built the Empire State Building and we can make operas and we've got cars and we can drink Mountain Dew. But I don't think that's success. Success is the most biodiverse, the most obvious, the most out there in all the different ecosystems on the planet. That is success biologically, and insects embody that in terms of the animal life on this planet. And they've gotten to the pinnacle of achievement within the animals by being so nimble, so adaptable. And one of their big adaptations is being able to come up with these overwintering strategies and to buffer the effects of cool weather and cold temperatures. These things have been around for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years in some cases. They're not getting knocked out by any winter that didn't completely cripple us. If we're not talking about the ice form sheets forming like in the day after tomorrow, the insects are going to be fine. They're going to find a way to get through this. So let's talk about some of the ways that they have developed to do that. The biggest one is, frankly, is migration. One way to get away from cold temperatures is to say, I'm out of here. I don't want to be around it. We might call it the snowbird method. We see it with geese. We see it with other migratory birds. We see it with people, right? Some folks that are tuning in may be watching from a different state than Kentucky because they haven't returned from the winter place that they go to kind of wait out the cold period. So these insects, in order to avoid being frozen, they just pick up sticks and they go as far away from the cold as possible. We see this with a number of species. Either they migrate and leave, or the ones that are in the cold areas may die, and only the ones that are living in the warmer areas will survive to recolonize the colder areas the next year. But this migration strategy is a great way to avoid ice, which is what this all boils down to. Insects and other things that are outside don't want to get frozen. And getting frozen means having ice crystals form inside of your body. And if we can avoid that by migrating, that would be great if you're an insect. This isn't unique to just vertebrates, as I was sort of talking about before. Insects are capable of considerable amounts of migration. Various species of dragonflies migrate across the ocean. There are lots of butterfly species that migrate. The most famous one is the monarch, but there are others such as the painted lady, which will migrate pretty great distances to get away from certain temperatures. to end up in an area that's a little more amenable to them. Here's an example of a dragonfly that migrates around 11,000 miles per round trip, where they start in April in the Maldives. They go to India in August. By October, they're back in the Maldives. They're in the Seychelles, then they're in Mozambique, and then they'll end up back in India to finish the whole trip off. So that's pretty impressive that they're able to do that. You can see dragonflies sometimes out on the ocean where they're doing this migratory behavior. I'd say, like I said before, the biggest one is the monarch in the United States. The monarch is very famous for having this migratory pattern. This is more of a central and eastern United States phenomenon where we have the monarch that goes on the move. The monarch has been a very famous butterfly for the U.S. for a long time. It was almost the national insect a couple decades ago, but it was pointed out that it does live in Canada and Mexico for considerable parts of the year as well, and that perhaps we had sticky fingers if we were going to nab it as our national insect. So it wasn't selected for that, but it's still beloved. People go out and do monarch conservation on their properties. Schools will plant monarch gardens. We see people trying to tag them every fall to help monitor for them and doing conservation for them. And a lot of that boils down to how pretty they are. Monarchs are this beautiful orange and black coloration. They have white spots on their wings as well. The monarch, it appears on one of our license plates here in Kentucky now. It has replaced the Viceroy butterfly, which is actually the state butterfly that used to be on some of the environmental plates. I'm a little salty about that. I think that the monarch gets enough attention. We should have left the Viceroy on there. But they look very similar, and they're pretty in their own right, I guess. As a caterpillar, they're also very interesting. When they're big, they're black and yellow and white and striped, as we see here. They have these almost tentacle-like feelers that stick off of their head and rear end. And they're most famous as larvae for feeding on milkweed. This is the thing that we plant for them to try and help conserve them. As they feed on the milkweed, they absorb some defensive compounds from that plant, and now they're protected for life as well, which is why they have this bright coloration. They're warning predators not to eat them. In the winter, where they're at right now is down deep in Mexico in some forests of open elf fir, and they have a very specific spot that they return to every year. And those overwintering ones flew down from the United States and found this spot in Mexico to hang out for the winter. They will then return to the southern United States here in a couple of months, and they will begin the slow process of kind of recolonizing the United States. Over successive generations, they move north and north and north until they reach Canada. And then the final generation is the one that will fly all the way back down to Mexico to perform the same migratory overwintering pattern. This is the situation that you would see if you visited the Oyamel fir forest down in near Mexico City. It's magical from what I've been told. There are fewer and fewer of the butterflies every year, and there are fewer and fewer of these trees, unfortunately, which may have some connection. But we're seeing fewer monarchs, and we're seeing this migratory pattern be disrupted in some ways. But this is what you would find if you went down there on a good year. Lots of these butterflies hanging out, staying still all winter, so they can start the cycle anew for us here in 2026. If we didn't want to look at that one, we might see something similar to the fall armyworm. This is an insect that also migrates north over successive generations. But everybody that gets to, say, Michigan or Minnesota in one year, they're all going to freeze to death. And only the insects that live in the southern tips of Texas and Florida will be able to survive. So it's the only spot hot enough for them in the United States. They are more tropical species, so they survive in nations further south of us. But here in our country, this is the only spot that they'll survive. And then again, they'll migrate north to reconquer the United States and feed on things. So they're not good at migrating. They're not good at getting away from the cold temperatures. They're good at surviving where it is warm enough for them to do so. If you are a non-migratory species, though, you still got to figure out a way to deal with the cold. You have to figure out a way to deal with being chilled down. Insects freeze to death very differently than we do. And what that boils down to is species of insects each have their own lethal temperature and then a lethal amount of time that they must stay at that temperature or lower before they will freeze to death. And this is a much slower process than what we would see with a human or a rabbit or a dog or what have you when they're exposed to these cold temperatures. One example that I might throw out would be bed bugs, which have to be at 0 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 5 days before they'll actually freeze to death. And this is true for all insects. All species have their own lethal temperature and lethal amount of time that they have to stay at that. In this sort of milieu, what we're talking about are insects that are either freeze tolerant, meaning that they can be frozen solid and then survive, or things that are freeze intolerant. So, a freeze tolerant insect, the most famous example that you could go out and find every fall is the woolly bear caterpillar. Woolly bear caterpillars are able to actually control where ice crystals form in their body, and they can survive the freezing process. So they're freeze tolerant. The woolly bear is also pretty famously associated with winter prediction skills. It's variously said that you have to count the number of brown and orange bands on the body, and it will tell you how many weeks of winter will be cold. It's also just how brown or how black they are, and like just a bird's eye view at them. And the darker they are, and the more dark ones that we find, the worse the winter will be. This has been proven to be less successful than what we have with meteorological technology, but it's still something that's a lot of fun to talk about. I believe there's even a woolly bear festival in eastern Kentucky. It's in West Virginia, but it's over that direction where they celebrate these meteorological insects. Interestingly, with their lack of ability to predict freezing, it's cool because they are actually good at being frozen. So they produce what we call glycerol, which is the same thing as what we see with antifreeze, basically. And they produce this glycerol, and it can control where ice may form in the body. It also can mean that they're exposed to cold temperatures like we had this winter, and they don't freeze. It's not cold enough to induce the freezing. So this is helping them to sort of determine where ice could form in the body. The glycerol isn't going to be sort of saturated, it's not going to be everywhere, but it will be in important places, like in their hearts, in their digestive tract, and they will focus on freezing things like their fat bodies. Insects need fat bodies in them to help with their immune response and to detoxify things. They use it for those processes. But in the winter, they don't need it for that. And so it is a handy place to be able to store sort of ice crystallization, and you're not really losing anything in the process. If fat gets frozen and thaws out, you'll probably be fine. If ice crystals form in your guts, the crystals could shred your stomach or shred your intestines, and then you're not going to survive that process. So they do this very scientifically through the use of this antifreeze-like compound. There are others which are freeze intolerant, and they have to avoid the freezing temperatures by finding a warm spot where they live. Some insects find harborage in the soil. Some insects find harborage in leaf litter, like we see with the lady beetles in the middle. Some even make their own harborage. They construct something that helps them to survive the winter. Everybody wants the bagworms to freeze in their trees over the winter, but those bags that the eggs are in over the winter, and also their mother's corpse essentially is in there. All of that adds up to a nice protective layer that keeps the cold air temperatures from seeping in. So it could be 10 degrees outside, but it is a nice and balmy 31 or 32 inside of the bag, and therefore they're not freezing. The same is true for these grubs. They're in the soil. The soil buffers them from some of those cold air temperatures. The leaf litter can do that as well. The temperature that you're being told on the news, we're taking that reading just out in the open, right? We're reading the air temperature wherever the scientific instruments are, and it's telling us it's that cold there. But it's not that cold everywhere. There's all kinds of nooks and crannies in nature that things like insects can take advantage of and find somewhere that's just slightly warmer that's going to help them to survive. Unfortunately, this can also mean that our homes are of interest to some of them. Our homes mimic and even supplant some of these natural overwintering sites. If your house is on the top of a hill, if your house is a sort of natural color, like in the browns or khakis and whites kind of range, if you have a large south or western facing exposure, if you have lots of holes in your home, if you've not done caulking, maybe you just got new windows and the gaps are still present. If you don't have a good door jamb, or if that stuff on the bottom of your garage door is missing, there could be access points that these organisms will find. And then they look at your house and they say, oh, this is a deluxe premium heated condo for me over the winter. And they'll move in, often up into attics and soffits and other kind of out of the way areas that will give them a nice tidy place to be for the winter. We see it with multicolored Asian lady beetles. We see it with brown marmorated stink bugs. We also see it with cluster flies and a few others. So that's how they do it. They're probably fine. I'm going to guess that we're going to come out of this just fine for most of the insects. They probably didn't even notice what we noticed. They didn't have to salt their sidewalks or plow their roads. They didn't have school get canceled. They're just going to wake up and get going or hatch out of their eggs and get going in the spring, and it won't even be a blip on the radar for them.
Well, that was awesome. Thank you so much. And I was thinking I'm gonna have to get you to do how many insects are actually in our home, and then I thought, well, maybe I don't want
We
to know.
don't want to know that, right? Right?
This is like I might not want to know how many there are.
So, yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
There's the average American home contains 100 species of arthropods in it.
Wow.
Oh.
Yep.
And how many pounds do we eat a year of insects and
I think
everything?
that depends on what you eat. If you
Okay.
eat a lot of rice, you might have more than some other people. If you like figs,
Yeah.
I wouldn't read about fig wasps or anything
Okay.
like that.
All
Yeah,
right.
fig
Thank
Stay away
Newtons,
from
that
that.
kind of stuff. Yeah,
you. Okay.
there's lots
Got
of
it.
wasp parts that are in figs. So
Oh,
Gosh, the more you know, right?
the more you know, the less you eat,
I know.
the more you move to a different dessert.
Yeah, you're like, oh man, what's going on here?
yeah.
Oh, Dr. Larson, man, always
So
appreciate your
much.
content. You educate us so much in such an entertaining way. We
Well,
really do appreciate
I appreciate the chance to talk about some basic insect biology in an applied way. I mean, it is important that people know about that the bugs, they've been around for a long time. They know how to handle these kinds of things. I'm more worried about if it gets hotter and hotter over the winter, actually, what will perturbate some of these organisms. Will their life cycles change? If they will emerge earlier, will it change pest patterns? These are the kinds of things that we've kind of got our eye on as we see some of these odd things happening with temperature. It just might mean that there's different times that they come out and they may survive better or they may survive worse. If we have these nice warm days like this and they all start crawling out and then we get zapped again with
it.
another cold spell, we could see some death and destruction, say in April or early April. Or if we keep having these really, really wet times of year in the spring, that could also be bad. They're trying to break over wintering. They're stretching and yawning and coming out of their sleeping bags, and then there's a flood. That's not good for them. They're not strong enough to overcome it. So there could be some changes coming, but right now I'm guessing they're doing just fine with the cold.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had several comments of people that said that they've already had ticks on them for the last
Yeah.
2 weeks. And I was like,
Well,
oh no.
somebody did ask, were are ticks native to Kentucky? I'm assuming we have some that are native, or are they
Yeah.
all introduced?
No, the major ones are native. There is an invasive species, the Asian longhorn tick, but the other ones that we're familiar with, they're germane to the area.
Now,
The dog
one of
tick.
one of our viewers was asking that did Daniel Boone get ticks back then?
That's a good question. I don't know if he ever wrote about it.
Yeah.
That would be something to go back and check. I'm sure that they got ticks on them, but you're right. It feels like historically we didn't see a lot of complaints about ticks. Like I'm not
Mm-mm.
familiar with that literature at least.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in Southeast Kentucky, and I remember running around the mountains all the time,
All the time.
and then down by the Cumberland River and playing in it, and I can't recall a tick ever,
Yeah.
growing up.
No.
So it's just
Some of
interesting, yeah.
some of that boils down to the American dog tick used to be the more common tick in the state, and now it's Lone Star tick. The Lone Star tick is not invasive. It is native. It's from this part of the country, but it's gotten worse over the years, and kind of, I don't want to say invaded Kentucky, but it's gotten more prominent,
Its
and now
population is,
yeah,
yeah.
it's now the number one tick, which means that we get a lot more pressure for people when they start going out in the spring because they just have more. There's more of them. They hatch synchronously, so you can
Yeah.
step into a tick bomb. They're
Oh,
they're a
yeah.
gnarly little critter, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also had a question. Oh, go ahead, Billy.
No, I was going to ask, this is a season that a lot of our friends will be doing prescribed burn or controlled burns,
Mhm.
um, fire out there on the landscape. And, I know you talked about winter, and they can survive that. But what if
Right.
we burn the ground? How does that do
So
with tick populations and stuff like that?
that's one of those things that I need to probably write something up on because it's a question that we've received a few times
Right.
about I hate ticks so much, I'm willing to go out and burn my land. I've
Right.
never been a part of a prescribed burn for that.
Hmm.
There's also conflicting data out there on the topic, some of which seems to indicate a reduction in tick populations in the short term,
Hmm.
but then in the long term, depending on what grows back into the area, that there could be more ticks afterwards.
Yeah.
Oh.
There's also been associations with more incidents of ticks that are infected with pathogens after the burn, meaning that
Mm.
there's a higher likelihood of getting a tick-borne illness after
Mm.
that. So I'm not willing to say, yeah, everybody get your blowtorch and go out and
Right.
start burning them out. I think in the immediate aftermath, yes, you would see fewer ticks, but as the vegetation returns, some of
Sure.
the primary pioneer stuff is going to be really good tick
Perfect.
habitat
Yeah.
that they would
Yeah.
survive in. So if they get reintroduced quickly, they're going to thrive.
Okay.
So it's not
Gotcha.
necessarily the cure all that we would want it to be.
Sure. No,
Mm.
I think that's really interesting. A lot of times they're burning for, a habitat or for wildlife or, trying to get certain species back. But yeah, no, not necessarily ticks always come up. But I guess some people are looking at, getting rid of them with fire. So
So
interesting.
what about HWA survival in cold winter periods?
So they are susceptible to extreme cold, but I don't think that we hit those cold uh,
Really? That felt
temperatures.
Lord,
extreme to
Lordy,
me.
Lordy. I don't
Yeah.
want any colder than what we had.
I want to say that they die at -4 is when they start dying,
Oh,
and
wow.
then you start to see more death like once you approach -20 degrees, -20 degrees
Ugh.
Fahrenheit. I'm trying to think
So,
in Fahrenheit.
wow. Yeah. Yeah.
And we didn't reach that for a
No,
sustained
no,
period of time
No.
here.
no. I mean,
That's
Felt
really
like
the
it, but
key is the
okay.
sustained period of time. If they get exposed to zero
mhm.
degrees for a day, most of them are going to be fine. They will survive that crystallization process and they'll thaw out of it. But if it's held for a few days, that's when mortality can occur.
Interesting stuff. Gosh.
One
Well,
last question. Will
Okay.
anything kill Asian beetles in your home?
Once they're inside, what we recommend is usually just vacuuming, or if you've got like a big cluster of them that you can see, you
Mhm.
can hose them down with soapy water or scoop them into soapy water and kill them. We don't recommend home defense on them or a bug bomb where they're at, just some of these more mechanical means or physical means of removing them. On the outside, in late August, late September, if you're starting to see them alight on the home, like they're landing on the home, you can treat around the edges of your windows and around your baseboards and the foundation of the home with home defense
Mhm.
and ortho home defense, not an endorsement, just a recommendation. Then that will help to kill them before they crawl in. You can also, if you see them in clusters on the outside, soak them with soapy water and that will kill them. I do see a comment about the smell in your vacuum cleaner. They are quite odoriferous, especially in large numbers. So yes, it could potentially make an odor in your vacuum. You could sweep them up with a broom if you don't want that to happen to the vacuum, or if you empty the vacuum out afterwards. If you've got a canister, you can wash it out. If you've got a bag, that one is a little more hinky, I would say. I don't know if you want to wash a bag out and then try to reattach it to the vacuum cleaner. But yes, there is a smell produced by them, quite musky.
Hmm.
well, there was another comment that came in. We'll have to get another episode for you down the road. I'm Dr.
Mhm.
Larson,
Okay.
talking about woolly worms and racing them. And
Oh,
we,
I'd love it.
yeah, in Lee County, I guess they do woolly worm races
That's it.
to predict the weather. So
Yeah, yeah.
we'll have to, maybe we could do a
Oh,
live
live.
remote
Oh, yeah.
at the
Live remote
Woolly
Willy
Festival.
Worm
Yeah.
Festival. That'd be cool.
I would love it as long as I get to be in costume.
Yeah, there we go.
Go
All
for
right.
it.
So Ted, hook us up there, buddy.
There
So
you go.
Well, I'm excited now to turn it over to my friend Ellen to hear
yeah.
about, I think, one
Yes.
of the worst plants that I've ever experienced in all my life.
Some people even put bounties out on these things,
Yes.
you know.
Yes, they
So,
put
and
bounties out on
speaking
these
of the
things.
bounty hunter herself,
Dr. Crocker, welcome to the show. We appreciate you being on. What are we talking about today?
Oh, well, we're gonna shift gears from talking about these insect invaders in our home to talking about a plant invader outside
Yeah.
that we also don't want and
No,
are
no.
not looking forward to
No.
seeing this time of year. We're going to talk about calorie pear.
Oh man, yes, and I know you've had a long relationship with this plant and have done a lot trying to address it. So,
And a lot
thank-
of people think it's a good thing, but we've got to
educate them.
educate. Hmm.
Yes.
Well, and I think that's really changing in that, I think that for a long time, uh, calorie pear was the tree to have, right? I mean, a calorie pear cultivar won Tree of the Year in an award in like 2005, I think. So, like, even until pretty recently, people really loved this species, and for good reason. Right now, it's getting ready to bloom. But there's a lot of negatives with it, whether it's in your yard, but especially once it gets out and about beyond that into your woods, into your old fields, it can be a real problem. So that's what we're going to talk about today.
All right.
Yeah. Well, thanks for dropping some knowledge on us as always and helping all of our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, well,
Definitely.
it's springtime, and if you're like me, the warm weather and the flowers are very welcomed. But there's a flowering plant that you might also be seeing right now that you don't want to see in your woods, and that is calorie pear. So today we're going to talk about calorie pear, what it is, why it's a problem, and what you can be doing about it. So I bet that if you are watching us today, you have heard the story of calorie pear, commonly referred to as Bradford pear, or you can hear other cultivars that have been used for calorie pear over the years. People call this the worst tree ever. And that's because of what a nuisance it has become. This is a tree that's rapidly invading the eastern US, very common along the side of the road, in old fields, in edges, in your more open woodlands. And it's all because of the popularity of cultivars of the same species being planted as landscape ornamentals. And it seemed like a good idea at the time. You know, Now we know there's some problems with it. And one of those problems is that initially it was thought that the seed of these trees would be sterile. And it turns out that's not the case. It turns out that one single cultivar with one cultivar would be sterile. But once you get multiple cultivars and more genetic diversity in the mix, those seeds are no longer sterile. They will produce tons of them. They are carried and take over really quickly. So now we have pear trees popping up everywhere. And it's even banned for sale in many states due to the problems that it causes. Here are just some news clips from Illinois and South Carolina, Missouri, and Ohio, just among the states that ban the sale of calorie pear. Um, and so I bet you're familiar with this, but the kind of history behind the introduction of calorie pear is fascinating. So I'm just going to briefly mention this, in that it was introduced and really kind of spread broadly by this famous plant explorer, Frank Meyer, who was paid to explore Asia in the early 1900s, looking for plants that might be beneficial to the US. So he took several trips to China and Japan and Russia. And here you can see him looking like a real explorer, and brought back thousands of plants. And many of these are things that are edible. Everything from lots of different types of soybeans to alfalfa to stone fruits to nuts, as well as some ornamental trees. And if you have ever enjoyed a Meyer lemon, you can thank the namesake of the Meyer lemon, Frank Meyer, who was the one behind that. Well, one of the things that he was specifically tasked with looking for was calorie pear, because at the time we really didn't know a lot about it in terms of its role, but there were terrible diseases impacting fruiting pear trees. And the idea being, if we can get some of these other pear trees, find some that might be resistant to those diseases and cross them, use them in breeding, it could be really helpful in having more vigorous fruiting pear trees as edible pears. And so in his explorations, he was exploring and found this Callery pear. And one of his travel companions, some of the quotes from them saying things like, its ability to endure diverse and adverse soil conditions. It's a marvel, its rapid, vigorous growth, its long growing season that it has, just really impressed with it and brought back lots of seeds. And there is this really amazing article going through the history of Callery pear for anyone who's interested. I will pop that in the chat that Teresa Cully wrote for the Arnold Arboretum. So if you want to learn more, check that out. And you can see these great old photos of the Callery pear expeditions. And so those seeds were brought back to the US and they were planted and tested for various things, including disease resistance. And it was found to be a good and hardy stock for those fruiting pear trees. But then a little later in the 1950s, among these planted Callery pears, one was discovered that was a little different. It didn't have the long thorns that are the classic of Callery pear. And this one was propagated and grafted, thinking it might have ornamental value, and was later introduced as the Bradford flowering pear, named after a lead horticulturalist there. So if you've heard of the Bradford pear, that's where that name came from, that first cultivar. And while the Bradford pear was immensely popular, over time, many other cultivars were introduced, things like Aristocrat, Cleveland Select, Chanticleer, and others for different reasons. And over time, you have lots of these different cultivars of Callery pear just all over, really, really common tree planted as a street tree, planted as a yard tree. Some of your neighborhoods might look like this time of year. Here's an aerial shot that I found online that I really liked showing this neighborhood. Think of the percentage of trees in this neighborhood that are Callery pear. That's got to be around half of them. Really popular tree because of its nice flowers, because of its growth form, because of how hardy it was. But just right here, we're starting to see some of the problems with Callery pear. So first, someone in the chat raised this already. One problem, its smell. If you live in a neighborhood like that, where all your trees are Callery pear, right now you're enjoying the scent of the Callery pear tree. I don't know, you can type in the chat what you think it smells like, but it certainly does not smell good, especially when you have lots and lots of them really close by. So you might welcome the flowers, but not the scent. And second, many of the cultivars, especially that original Bradford cultivar, have poor form and they fall apart pretty fast. They don't tolerate some of our weather conditions here. You can see this one split right kind of down the middle where you have some weak branch attachments. So lots of these dense branches here, but they kind of get pulled off through wind and ice and other things. So not a terribly hardy tree, can be a real mess in your landscape. But the even bigger problem, and the reason why I'm talking about it today, is that it doesn't stay put. And those problems don't end in your yard. It moves out from there. It moves into forest settings and other natural areas. So in a forest setting, Callery pear can prevent a diversity of different desirable native species from establishing. And through that, it's going to negatively impact that regeneration and establishment. It's especially a problem in reforestation situations where you're trying to grow trees, you're trying to grow these trees that are going to be valuable long term, and instead you get a bunch of Callery pear in there. Also along forest edges and in your more open woodland understories. In addition, these wild growing Callery pears, while the cultivars don't have thorns, the wild growing ones do have large thorns that can prevent you from getting out and enjoying these areas, as well as being an ecological problem and an economic one. In open habitats, these dense Callery pear thickets can really take over and form these dense monocultures that are outcompeting other species. And this can present lots of different challenges, especially for grassland restoration and maintenance, since they really like those high light environments and they can take over really fast. There are also some concerns kind of related to both of those environments in terms of not only is this impacting the plant communities, but what is it doing to the insects that depend on those? What is it doing to the animals and to the wildlife? So these kind of trickling down ecological impacts of calorie pair invasion. So we've talked about calorie pair and why it's a problem and how it got to us. Let's talk a little bit about what it looks like and how you can identify it. So this time of year, it really sticks out because of the flowers. But in general, it's a small to medium deciduous tree. And I say tree, but sometimes the way that it's growing, it can look more like a shrub, have this really dense branch structure, forming these thickets. It's going to grow rapidly. And while those ornamental cultivars that we saw pictures of earlier, and you might be all too familiar with in your yard, have a compact and symmetrical tree form, they might look like a perfect little lollipop tree. Your wild growing calorie pear does not follow any of those rules. It's going to be more variable in form and often kind of leggy with this dense thicket structure instead. So the leaves are going to, when it gets them in just a little bit here, are going to be shiny and green, and they're oriented alternating on twigs. They tend to be a darker green color on top and a lighter green on the underside. And there's this really fine serration on the edges of the leaves there. The form and the shape of them can vary quite a bit, from more oval to more pointed shape of those leaves. And those leaves are going to turn color in the fall from deep purple, which you'll see in some of the cultivars, to maybe more red and orangish shades before dropping for the winter. As we've mentioned, it does have these little modified branches that form sharp thorns, which you won't see in their kind of ornamental parents, but you will see when they're growing out wild in your field. And of course, the star of the show this time of year, the flowers. These five-petaled flowers with lots and lots of blooms all over them. It's actually leafing out while it's flowering as well. And those flowers have a strong, fishy or rancid smell. And it's one of the first things to bloom in the spring. So it really sticks out this time of year. And those new shoots, in addition to having those flowers on them, are going to have a slightly reddish color with these tiny white little lenticels on the bark, as you can see in this video right here. As we're going through, look at that form of that tree. That's not a tidy calorie pear as you'd expect in your yard. That's a totally different beast. So those flowers are going to develop into these small, hard, round, green to brown fruits that are produced in the summertime. And then these are going to stick around, and over the winter, they're going to get softer, which at that point they can be eaten by birds and carried and spread calorie pear where you don't want it. So where is calorie pear a problem? Calorie pear prefers full sun conditions and is most problematic where you've got those really higher light levels. So along roadsides, old fields, open woodlands, edges, disturbed areas. I'm not saying it can't be a problem in other areas, but those high light settings are really the biggest concern. And as was noted in those initial, really early exploratory missions looking for calorie pair, it can thrive in lots of different soil conditions and different types of areas. So let's look at a map of where we see calorie pair reported right now in North America. So I got this map from the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System website, EDMAPS. If you haven't checked it out, it's a great way to both report invasive species, but you can also see maps of where they are and even get maps of what kind of areas are at risk in the future. So we can see on this that pretty much all of the eastern US There's a lot of calorie pear spreading through there, and where we are here in Kentucky, um, most counties have calorie pear already. Another great website and app that I love for both looking at species and reporting them is iNaturalist. Now, you can use iNaturalist for lots of different things, and it'll even help you identify things that you take pictures of. But it's a wonderful citizen science platform, too, because I can go and you can go on iNaturalist and you can look up calorie pair and find it all across the globe. So, where have people reported seeing it? And this is kind of cool because we can see it, here in its native range. We can see it in other parts of the world where it's been introduced and some areas where it's also causing problems. And then we can look here in North America, where not only is it a problem in the east, but we can also see it popping up on the west coast. If we were to zoom in on our region, what we would see, I think, is a bit of a trend of we have our major urban areas. Here's Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Lexington, Louisville, and a lot of concentration of calorie pair coming out from there. Well, why is that? My guess is because that's where we planted lots of ornamental calorie pair, and that's where it's moving out from. So, not that it's not going to get other places in the future as well, but we had the highest densities of those ornamental pairs in those urban areas. So, what do you do about calorie pair? How do we deal with that? Because we're going to be dealing with calorie pair from here on out. It's here to stay, it's established in our natural areas. How can we be managing it? The first thing I'd say is don't plant calorie pear. Calorie pear might be banned for sale in some states, but not in Kentucky. And so you might still see it for sale. So don't make a mistake and plant it. Not only will that not be the best plant for you long term, but it doesn't stay put. And if you have one planted in your yard, you could consider an upgrade. There are programs that'll provide free trees in exchange for cutting down a calorie pear, Bradford pear bounties, and others. So check out, see what's happening in your local community. But there are some alternatives that are really wonderful. And, just to kind of drive home that point, this is a Bradford pear that I stumbled onto recently. And you can see it was planted here in this yard. And it's a cultivar of calorie pear, but behind it in this more natural area, we can see little calorie pears popping up everywhere that are probably coming from this larger tree, from the seeds of that larger tree. Plus, the other reason why you don't want a calorie pear in your yard necessarily, you can see signs on this one of where it has cracked apart. So it's lost half the tree. It's probably been a real pain to the people who live there trying to manage that. So just a couple good reasons why you can find better trees than calorie pear. And there are some fantastic alternatives to calorie pear, some of my personal favorites. And I'm thinking about what are the things that calorie pear gives us that we like. We know we don't want calorie pear, but we do like those spring flowers. We do like the fall color. We do like the small size. What are some other species that might be good fits? And the truth of it is that there are lots of them, but you always want to pick the best tree for your site. There's no one perfect tree for everywhere. You've got to think about what's that location, what's going to be best there, and what's going to fit that. But if we're looking for great eye-catching small trees that have pretty flowers and also maybe some fall color, some that come to mind for me are things like yellowwood. Here you can see its beautiful yellow fall color in the summertime. Now, it doesn't bloom in the spring, but in the summer when it blooms, it is spectacular. And I think it has really nice form. There's our flowering dogwood and several different dogwood species that could be a wonderful choice for landscape settings. There are many different cultivars of flowering dogwood that are available. Some are going to have different colors of flowers, different types of flowers, disease resistance. So another wonderful thing to look for. And, those flowers also say spring to me. Serviceberry, our native serviceberries, they're another really early season flowering tree with beautiful flowers and produce fruit. Lots of positives to that service berry, as well as cultivars of that might be a good choice for different situations. Red buds, again, you have their classic red bud that I think of, but there are also lots of interesting cultivars that are available if you're looking for a swap for that calorie pair. And then, while this is not a flowering tree and it's not a small tree, my very favorite fall color tree is black gum. I mean, you can't beat that for beautiful fall color in a native tree. So, just a few ideas. Feel free to put your favorites in the chat and let us know. But no need to turn to calorie pair when there are so many fantastic alternatives that you're going to be happier with long term. So, when it comes to managing calorie pair in natural areas, your woods, old fields, where you'd prefer to see a diversity of different native species, there are different options. And there's no one size fits all approach. The best depends on the size of the pair, the severity of the infestation, what else is growing there, and site characteristics, time of year, lots of different things. There's a really great resource that I'll drop into the chat about this. But one of the things that I would, first recommend thinking about is what are the size of the trees that you're working with? If you're talking about small trees, like pretty small trees, you can pull those up, but you want to be careful to get the entire root system. Otherwise, it can resprout from what remains there. In addition, for those small trees that are accessible, a foliar herbicide spray can be a great choice, especially if you can avoid any kind of desirable plants nearby, or if there aren't any desirable plants nearby. You just have tons of calorie pair. There are lots of different options for that and chemicals that would be effective. And a good time for that treatment would be in the summer or the early fall. Now, on the other hand, let's say you've got larger trees, maybe medium to really big trees. You're going to have a different set of options. You could mechanically remove those trees. You could mow them down. And I'll show a picture of that here, using different types of equipment, a forestry mulcher, or something else to take out these really dense thickets. But then you're going to need to follow up with either continuous mowing or directly applying herbicide to those cut stumps after you cut them, or a foliar herbicide spray of those new shoots, because otherwise, this doesn't take care of those roots. They're going to come right back. Now, this could be a really good choice for those really dense infestations where you just have calorie pair and other non-desirable species. Not as good of a choice if you want to be really directed and selective about what you're targeting, in which case maybe some of these stem-based applications would be more appropriate. So for your smaller trees that still have really thin bark, there are options for a basal bark herbicide application, and these are trees that are going to be less than 6 inches in diameter. But then for your bigger trees, you could do a hack and squirt herbicide application. So not as much work as cutting a tree down. Instead, you're using a hatchet to create these openings in the tree and applying the herbicide directly into those cuts. And of course, you can do a cut stump application where you're cutting that tree down and applying the herbicide directly to that cut stump. And the goal of the herbicide in that case is to prevent resprouts, which calorie pair will certainly do afterwards. If you're not doing that, you do want to be really careful about those resprouts, making sure to either treat them later on or not let them establish into a tree again. So either way, no matter what you're doing, you've got to monitor for new arrivals and resprouts and seed coming up from the seed bank. I like this picture because it shows a calorie pair in a field in the spring, and you can see it. You can see it from a mile away almost. And so this is a great time to scout for calorie pair. So look for it right now, and mark it for management later, because while now's a great time to scout for it, a lot of those techniques I mentioned might be more effective if they're done a little bit later in the season. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. Hopefully you learned a little bit about calorie pair and you can get out there, find some, and get rid of it.
Well, thanks, Dr. Crocker. We greatly appreciate that. And we do have a couple of questions. One was, how should the debris be handled after cutting?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that depends. For a lot of these, if you're talking about more of a woodland setting where you're just cutting down a few individual plants, you could leave those there. You could maybe create some wildlife habitat with them. You could certainly chip them up as well if you have equipment and access to that. Now, if they are in fruit, I would avoid moving anything around or chipping it up because then you're going to take those seeds with you and spread them.
Oh, not good.
Yeah, we don't want a bigger
Deal with
problem,
that.
right?
No
Yes.
more calorie repair.
Yeah.
We have enough. We don't need more.
Yeah.
Right. There was also a question of where's a good place to get these other trees, the native trees that you were talking about.
Oh, there are so many. There's a lot of different wonderful tree vendors out there.
Mhm.
There are great native species available at many of our local retailers. So some of the most popular tree species around are cultivars of native species. I'm thinking of things like red maple and swamp white oak and the oaks, any of the oaks, amazing. But some of our more challenging to find native species, we have vendors in the state that specialize in native plants. If you're interested in that, the Kentucky Native Plant Society has a wonderful list of different vendors that I can pop in the chat. And they're just people who are kind of focused on native plants.
Mhm.
Not at all comprehensive, but a good starting place. And if you're a plant person, super fun to visit one of them and just see the different things that they're growing and think about landscape uses for some of these plants that we might normally see growing out in the wild.
They also want to know, is now a good time to plant the tree?
Oh, yeah, I
Not the
think
calorie, right?
not. Oh,
No,
it's never a good
no,
time to plant
to
a tree.
plant a native tree.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Yes. It's a
Yeah.
common time for us to plant, basically up through April. March and April are common tree planting times here in Kentucky.
And
Yes.
fall is also
Yeah.
good, but we typically avoid the summer just because it's hot and it's dry and it's tough to keep up with the amount of watering those new trees would need.
And do you have any of those bounty programs going on right now?
Hopefully, some coming soon. Well, we'll let you know.
Okay.
Yes. There you go. Oh,
We'll advertise it on here when it
yes.
does.
Yes, widely. Dr. Crocker, really enjoyed your segment today. The
Yes.
depth was really nice. I really appreciated kind of that story, the origin story of how it got here, but and the alternatives. You did really a fabulous job. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah,
Really appreciate it. Thank
that's
you.
good. Really good stuff. Yeah. I told you, two of my favorite doctors,
I
man.
know, right?
They kick butt. They're
They
awesome.
did. It was a great show. Had a lot of information dropped on us and a lot of
Yeah.
things to think about, knowing that, those bugs are going to be with us.
I know.
So,
So make sure you're protecting yourself out there, right? As somebody that alpha
exactly.
gal, you don't want that. So yeah,
We might need to do a rooting out the myths on ticks and the
yeah.
woolly bear caterpillars.
Oh yes, yes. There's all kinds out there, but no, I really enjoyed the rooting out the myth segment today, and good job on that, Renee. So yeah,
Mhm.
thanks to our guest today, and thanks to you all for being with us. Right,
Yeah.
this program is for you. So we got some great comments today about some good subjects that we could kind of look into. Some we touched a little on, but others would be new for us for sure. So I'm really appreciate that. But let us know if you all are seeing things or you're dealing with issues on your own land or you're hearing other people dealing with it in your county. There's a good chance it's happening in other places, and we can all learn together. So let's do it. Let us know what you're dealing with, and let us help you try to address it.
And I've already asked about a couple of those topics being
That's
that were
awesome. I
suggested.
figured you had. No, good stuff.
I
Yes.
did.
Oh no, that's great.
But we thank you for watching us each and every week. And you can go to fromthewoodstoday.com and see
Yeah.
every show we've ever produced. So you might find some of those questions that you need answers to. They could be right there on other shows that we've done. But if there's something that you have, you can also go and fill out a little survey at fromthewoodstoday.com, and you can submit pictures or anything else like that you're seeing in your woods, because we want to hear from you. So you just
Sure do.
keep those ideas coming. I'm getting more and more each week, and I love it.
Yeah. Great.
It means that I'm not giving you what I think you might want. You're giving me what you want. So I love
Yeah,
that.
that's awesome. Yeah, good stuff. All right, folks. Well, we appreciate you as always each week, and we'll look forward to seeing you all next week on From the Woods Today.
Take care. Bye.
From the woods today. From the woods. woods today.